and welcome to From Another Angle, a Carnegie Council podcast. I'm Hilary Sutcliffe and I'm on the board of the Carnegie Council for AI and Equality. In this series, I get to talk to some of today's most innovative thinkers who take familiar concepts like democracy or human nature, regulation, or even the way we think about ourselves and show them to us from a quite different angle. What really excites me about these conversations is the way they challenge our fundamental assumptions. And certainly for me, and I hope for you too, their fresh thinking makes me see the world in a new way and opens up a whole raft of possibilities and ways of looking at the future. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Claudia Chwalisz, who I first met when she was working on the future of democracy at the OECD, and now runs a research and action institute called DemocracyNext. And, unsurprising perhaps, we are going to be talking about democracy, because we all know about democracy, right? You know, you have elections, you vote for whichever politician seems likely to deliver what you want, someone wins, then they get on governing until 4 years later when you get to decide whether they did a good job or not, and you get another go. But Claudia has different ideas. How about a democracy that is, well, much more democratic than that, and might even do away with elections altogether? Welcome, Claudia, and thank you so much for coming to talk to us.
Thank you, Hilary. I'm delighted to be here and nice to have this chance to exchange on your podcast.
Great. Well, shall we start by taking a look at what democracy actually means and where it came from? Because, and for me, I wasn't really clear after all what democracy did mean. And I think it's come to mean elections, but I was surprised to learn from your work how it's meant many different things to different societies over the years. Could you just give us a run through about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good starting point for this conversation because it challenges a bit our assumptions. And I think in the context of this wider democratic crisis that there's a relative consensus that we're living in, the notion of what is even democracy, I think comes up a lot. And the notion of democracy as elections has just become enshrined as though this is given. It's in the UN Declaration on Human Rights. It's the way that most people think about it. But actually, if we take a step back in history, it's actually very recently that this notion of democracy came to be associated with elections. So not that elections are anything new by any means. They've always been around, but the ancient Greeks and at different points from then on, elections were considered a form of oligarchy. And it's only much more recently that we started calling them democratic. So at this point after the French and American revolutions, when most of the institutions that we think of as representative democracies today were established, the architects of those institutions were actually designing them to be intentionally oligarchic. And the word democracy was never even used. It's only much later when suffrage started to spread did people start referring to this system as representative democracy. And today we often just say democracy to talk about it, but that doesn't actually make it democratic. So I think this moment that we're in today causes us to reflect on this. And the ancient Greeks referred to democracy as the sorts of institutions that were comprised of people who were actually selected by lottery. That in combination with institutions that participation was open to all. Now, of course, at that time that was limited to men of a certain status, etc. But we can take that principle and the premise of it, both in terms of the random selection by lottery and that participation by all, and think about how do we apply that in a modern context today.
Very interesting, absolutely, because let's be honest, I know I'm in the UK, you're in France, and obviously the Carnegie Council is based in America, and democracy is not doing so well at the moment. It's not necessarily doing so well at the things that it aspires to do well with. So perhaps you could look for us about what about democracy isn't working in the current system, and how your new ideas could make a new system that actually is more democratic than the elections that we've come to know and think of as democracy in action.
Yeah, I think this sense of democracy not working is incredibly widespread. And I actually came to all of this work through my research that I was doing on populism and trying to understand the extent to which people's disillusionment with politics, with the system, but also feeling like they didn't have a voice nor the agency to be really shaping the decisions that were affecting their lives was driving people towards populist parties, populist actors. Now, of course, it's a complex phenomenon, so that's not the only thing, but it is a big part of that picture, and it's related to those deeper underlying causes. And if that's the case, it's never going to be top-down decisions on the economy or anything else that really gets to the heart of why people, I think very legitimately, feel like they're so far away from actually having control over their lives. There's a reason why phrases like take back control resonate with people too. And so looking at this from this perspective, I think that's why these different democratic innovations that are trying to create meaningful ways for people to really be able to get involved in public decision making are having some resonance as a way to really not just be treating the symptoms of these problems, but actually those deeper underlying root causes of them.
Yes, indeed, because I've spent the last 3 or 4 years looking at trust, and particularly trust in governance. In my work on trust over the last few years, I've noticed how inclusion, which is a fundamental driver of trust, has been at the root of people's confidence or lack of confidence with governance. And talking to the OECD, your colleagues, looking at how the parliamentary system, the policy system, is more effective if it's more inclusive, seemed to me to be a very interesting way forward. And I know that you are talking to quite a number of governments who are much more open to giving up their power to citizens than I would have expected to have happen.
Yeah, indeed. And I think we often think of that trust problem as the issue is that people have lost trust in government, whereas actually I think that it's just as much, if not a bigger problem, the lack of trust that government has in people. And I think it's a self-reinforcing cycle in many ways. And the way out of it is obviously something that will take some time, because it takes time to genuinely build trust. There's no shortcut to doing that, as I'm sure you know through all the work you've done on this topic. And so that's also why there's no other way to do it besides governments actually creating these meaningful ways for people to be able to have a say in shaping decisions. And that's why this question of power, which is hard to talk about, is actually at the heart of all of this, because it's only through demonstrating through actions and creating those genuine possibilities will things ever really start to change.
Yes, because I quote a lot the Global Satisfaction with Democracy report of 2020, who was saying that, satisfaction with democracy is falling because citizens' expectations aren't excessive or unrealistic, but democratic institutions are falling short of what matters most for their own legitimacy, and including, and we know this from the UK, probity in office, upholding the rule of law and responsiveness, and ensuring sort of upholding the values of society. So democracy and elected democracy isn't even doing the job that it's supposed to do very well. And the system itself isn't upholding the values that they do talk about in elections. And you have a vision and new ideas for a different type of system. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, indeed. And actually, it makes me realize I didn't fully answer your previous question also about what's not working in the current system.
Tell us that. We know
because
that,
I started on one part of it, but there's actually a lot more, and that has to do with this concentration of power in the hands of very few people, actually. And the short-termism, which is just ingrained in the design of a system that's run around electoral cycles that are on these short-term bases, and campaigns starting a good year or more before the next election. And so everything sort of stops. And this actually has a really detrimental effect, not only on the incentives that drive the decision making that have to do with campaigning and lobbying and receiving funds for all these things, but also have a detrimental effect, I think, on the actual quality of decisions and the decision making not being optimized to bring out the collective intelligence of society and to put the public good first. And so I suppose to come back to your actual question now about the vision for another kind of democratic future, to me, this brings in these democratic principles of citizen participation, representation by lottery, and deliberation. And I can maybe expand on that a little bit more so it sounds less abstract if you like.
Yes, please do, please do.
Yeah. So perhaps think of it this way. So imagine that today when you get home, you receive a letter in your mailbox, and it's an invitation to be considered for your country's new executive assembly. So just like all the other people who received this invitation at random, if you choose to accept, it means putting your name in the hat for a second lottery to ensure that members of this top decision-making body will broadly and equally represent society's diversity. Now, last year, it was your partner who was invited to serve on the Climate Policy Assembly. And what surprised them most was that after all of those deep-felt discussions, the Assembly was able to find common ground on difficult issues from energy sources and subsidies to renewables investment, extreme weather mitigation plans. And just now, your best friend is serving on the most recent Judiciary Selection Commission, which was set up to take the partisanship out of the appointment of judges. And maybe many years ago, it was your daughter who was serving as a member of the Legislative Assembly. And like jury duty, anybody who's selected by lot to any of these assemblies is entitled to paid time off work to take up those civic duties. Childcare, transport, other costs are all covered, and you receive a good state salary for your time, the same way that elected officials were once paid. And the task on all these assemblies is to weigh evidence, to listen to one another, and to find common ground on our policy and legislative proposals. So rather than going to the ballot box once every 5 years, there are regular lotteries for different assemblies all the time. And instead of parties and professional politicians, it's ordinary citizens, people like me and you, your mom, your dad, sisters, brothers, friends, colleagues. We're the ones in charge, taking turns representing others and being represented. So this is the sort of a vision, perhaps, of what another kind of democracy that is not just all about elections could actually look like. Thinking about this in the complex way that we actually have a whole set of different complex policy issues, public decisions to be taken, and how could we reimagine another kind of democratic system that could have a different functioning logic, putting forth the public good, acknowledging that people should have political equality, creating the conditions for people to be able to bring out collective intelligence, but also to do that hard work of finding common ground. This is the sort of vision for another kind of democratic future that we're working on at Democracy Next.
And it is very exciting. I've been involved in a number of public dialogues and advisory boards on various different subjects, and it's always surprised and shocked me how sensible these are. And, you know, people might be frightened, I might be frightened thinking, well, look, you know, I don't want it all to be down to me, but actually that's not what it's about. It's the process. And I think one of the things, the process of democracy now is actually undemocratic, and this process is democratic. And I found that there's a great quote from on a website got them for Involve, this super organization in the UK, that says policymakers think that engagement is all about getting shouted at in church halls and it's all really frightening. But actually, when they're involved in serious processes like citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, they really, really see the legitimacy and effectiveness of these processes, which is much more effective than shouting at each other in Parliament from our little perspectives and not budging an inch. These processes are quite fluid, and they are really quite, I think one of the things I'm just thinking of, one I did on a quite complicated science subject. People really can get their heads around really complicated scientific subjects and come up with regulation in this case that was proportionate, sensible, and actually avoided all of this new me push-pull, you know, capture by industry, all of the things that make part of this democratic decision-making really ineffective and unhelpful and unrepresentative.
Completely. I mean, I'm fully with you on this, and we have so many examples actually from around the world on citizens being able to deliberate on all sorts of different complex policy issues, from technical things around AI regulation to urban planning decisions and long-term infrastructure investment plans, and how should we regulate the big tech companies, and all sorts of different issues. Should we change the constitution on abortion? Or should we change the constitution on same-sex marriage? So ranging from these maybe more high-level moral dilemmas to also quite what are considered technical issues around climate change policy and adaptation and so on. And it's about designing and creating these conditions for people to be able to have the time and the resources to be able to grapple with that complexity of the issues, and also have that time to be able to really listen to one another and to have the time to deliberate. Because again, there's no shortcut to trying to find some middle ground or some common ground on these complex issues where there isn't one right, in quotes, answer, but it's something actually we need to decide together as a society, because these are ultimately all political issues.
Absolutely. And I liked at your launch, actually, your colleague Art O'Leary was working in Ireland, that a lot of the issues facing policymakers today are not black and white. It's all shades of grey. And I like the quote that every political system needs to see this as a way of getting hard jobs done. Those jobs that are about societal values, how do we do this? How do we make these trade-offs? This is the best way of getting these things done, rather than the guys, let's be honest, in Parliament, in some back room, figuring it out and being lobbied by various different sort of vested interests, and then something comes out of the sausage machine and we don't know what it's about. So I like this idea of this new approach is about getting hard jobs done. And tell us some of the examples that you've had about some hard jobs. I think really innovative, interesting ways of doing something that would have not resulted in a societal consensus in any other way.
Indeed. And I mean, I think before sharing one or two examples, which is, I think, the best way, I do want to make it clear that there are actually hundreds of examples. At the OECD, we looked at 600 of these deliberative assemblies. So citizens' assemblies or citizens' juries or panels, they go by different names, but all these processes that have in common the fact that people are randomly selected to be broadly representative, and then have the time to grapple with decisions and have to work towards common ground on their shared recommendations. And so these have ranged from urban planning to climate change to infrastructure and so on. But I think some of the most powerful come from Ireland. Actually, you made reference to this earlier, but it's been a decade that Ireland has been using citizens' assemblies on an ongoing basis at the national level. And one of the most best known examples is the citizens' assembly that they had about changing the constitution around abortion. So this took place during a process they were doing between 2016 and 2018. There were 100 people randomly selected to be representing that diversity of Irish society. And they heard from lots of different experts on the issue, but also advocates from both sides of it. They heard from people with lived experience. They listened to one another, and they recommended that Ireland should change the constitution on abortion. But they also made more nuanced recommendations about if people were to vote for this change, how should the legislation change? So going into the more nuanced discussions about under what conditions and when, etc. Those are those tricky dilemmas where there is no quote unquote right answer in a way. So it's not just a black and white or yes or no question about abortion, yes or no. It's actually, again, in those shades of gray. And so this assembly did recommend there should be a referendum, which did take place, and the Irish public voted in favor of constitutional change. And it's one of 4 constitutional referendums that have taken place after citizens' assemblies have recommended them. So the other ones were on same-sex marriage, on divorce, and on blasphemy. And the most recent citizens' assembly on gender equality that took place last year also had a whole host of different recommendations. And actually, the Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss also recommended a constitutional referendum, which would give nature the same rights within the Constitution. So it hasn't been decided yet whether that will actually happen. But just to say, there's actually been this great diversity of issues, also including climate change, devolution of power, you know, a whole host of different issues that have been tackled in this way. And that's why you mentioned that quote by Art O'Leary, that this was actually in reference to how Irish society views these citizens' assemblies. People in Ireland see citizens' assemblies as the way to get hard stuff done.
It is astonishing. I remember reading about another example in Taiwan, the V-Taiwan process, which is online and offline, and how they'd been for 4 years trying to do online alcohol regulation the hard way. And then they did a collaborative process with citizens, and it took 4 months. Everybody agreed, the parliament agreed, and it was done. And so, you know, people think of these deliberative processes as incredibly long and tortuous. They actually can shortcut processes and have things done with greater legitimacy in a shorter time, which I was quite surprised by, to be honest.
There is often this notion that citizens' assemblies are so time consuming, you know, to take 6 months on an issue, but actually they're often unblocking problems on which politicians have been just stuck and doing nothing, sometimes for years or decades. And so I think we need to look at it in this bigger picture. Like, for instance, now there's a citizens' assembly at the national level taking place here in France around end of life issues, euthanasia, assisted dying. Again, not an easy dilemma, and it's something that has been in the wider political debate for many years. And citizens are now meeting over the course of 9 weekends between December and March to come up with recommendations for how to move forward on this issue. So it might seem like, yes, a long period of time, but it's also a complex issue. And they're actually spending more time deliberating, examining it from all angles than most politicians spend on the issues they're legislating on as well. So it's also, what is the point of comparison here too?
Yes, that's interesting. I talk to policy people on and off, and I'm always a little bit horrified how undeliberative it is and how quickly they've all got to do it, and how little thought in some ways goes into quite difficult decisions. And I hear that these processes are actually something that policymakers are saying, well, actually, it does give us legitimacy. Actually, it's not all my problem then in that case. You know, it's something that they can really feel gives their job legitimacy. But you've got even more adventurous ideas than having policymakers use these processes as part of the sort of the democratic deliberations of elected parliaments. You're thinking of doing away with elections altogether. So tell us about how that's going to work.
Yes, I think that's the maybe black and white way of putting it, and it's also existing in some shades of gray. But I think what I'm working on and what we're thinking about at Democracy Next is really trying to open up an imagination to what another democratic future could look like in the longer term, in the bigger picture, really questioning the centrality of elections in that. So perhaps there are still elections, but maybe they don't play that central role as defining what our system is today and defining what we consider as democracy. You know, if we look back at different points in history, if we go back to Athens, which some people might be more familiar with, there were some form of elections, but that was not the defining feature of the system. And that functioned together with different assemblies that were selected by lottery, different assemblies that were open participation to anybody. And I think we need to obviously examine this in a contemporary context today for the 21st century. But I think there's a lot of historical examples and a lot of really good contemporary examples like the ones we've been talking about, which show us that there really could be another way, another democratic way that maybe doesn't involve elections or even political parties. And we don't have all the answers of what that looks like, but it's a bit of an exploration of what could we imagine this being, and then doing some more pragmatic work into rethinking how parts of the system today are working. So for an example, one of our strategic areas of work is around urban design and planning decisions. These take place on a continual basis. At any one moment in time, there's often 100 different planning decisions going on in a city. And so how could you actually rethink a system that involves people in a meaningful way as being the decision makers of those decisions that are affecting their everyday lives, like literally on the street, creating a way for them to be able to really weigh the trade-offs, get past the NIMBYism, which everyone talks about everywhere, and really get to another system that is genuinely democratic, and that we could be starting to see how this could function in a different way, but for one part of this wider ecosystem of decisions, if that makes sense. So there's both the big picture vision and then a more pragmatic route of thinking, what are the ways in which we can explore getting there?
Absolutely, that makes sense. And I think this is what this podcast is all about, Claudia. I'm so glad to have you on, about looking at the world in a new way, opening up new possibilities and ways of looking at the future. So thank you for doing exactly what I hoped. But tell us, what can people do who are interested in learning more about this? How can they get involved in different countries, and where can they go for more information, which we will put below in the notes below this podcast?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and I hope this has inspired some people to be interested in these questions. So I'm going to steal what I think is a really good end of conversation thing from Baratunde Thurston, where there's 3 different things he gets people to do at the end of his podcast. And one is just to internally reflect, what do you think it would feel like to live in another kind of democracy that doesn't necessarily have elections? Just to think about it. What could that feel like? Another is then to become more informed. So if you're interested in this, perhaps check out the DemocracyNext website. Maybe look into the OECD report on the deliberative wave. Look up some of the research that's happening in this area. And actually, we've posted a whole bunch of links also to other people's research through our link tree. So it's not just about promoting our own material here. And then the next is to publicly participate in some way or other. So there's this international network called Democracy R&D, and it has a network of practitioners and deliberative democracy organizations in different countries around the world. So perhaps if you're interested in your country, you can see what is the local organization that's doing this work there that you could contact. And otherwise, I would really encourage people to sign up to the DemocracyNext newsletter, because we are developing how we're going to set up a sort of community of people who are interested in these ideas in different ways. And so we are still in the planning phases of this, but we feel like there's so much interest internationally, but also just among people who are interested in this as citizens as well, not necessarily as people who are policymakers, etc. So we want to find a way to channel that energy and to bring people together and to help enable others to be bringing forth this work in different ways. So we will share updates about that and other things we're doing more broadly in the newsletter as well. So.
That's fantastic. So Claudia Chwalisz, thank you so much for envisioning this very exciting future for us. And I hope the listeners will get stuck in and make the world more democratic.
I hope so too. Thank you, Hilary, for hosting this. It's been a pleasure.